your discussion board answers. Again, I've been seeing a lot more of them, but at the same time, I want to keep you in the loop and make sure that you're doing everything that you need to be doing in terms of getting credit, because again, those points will add up very quickly in terms of, again, the success in this class. So let's talk a little bit about something different. And this is actually a chapter I really wanted to talk about since I even started with this class and since I was doing lecture prep. So this is talking about subliminal advertising. And subliminal advertising has been often talked about in terms of cognition when it comes to how we perceive things, how we incorporate things into our brain in terms of absorption, as retention, and so forth. And so there's a lot of recall and retention tests that occur within subliminal advertising. And for the longest time, from what we've known about subliminal advertising, is that we've got a couple case studies that I'll show you. And the old case studies kind of give this implication that it really doesn't work inherently. And that was mainly because there were small idiosyncrasies that exist in the advertisement that most people would talk about and say that this is not inherently something that I would remember. So case in point, when we look at something like product placement, there's a research article that talks about the notion of where it is in regards to the actual setting itself. So if it is within the context, if it's within the context of the story. So you can think of like Big Bang Theory, for instance, when Jim Parsons' character Sheldon Cooper has his little germaphobe episodes where he said Purell, 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 and runs towards the Purell. And that's actually a really good way of incorporating advertising within story. However, I've also given examples within Shameless, for instance, that a lot of products exist within the refrigerator of the show. And although it has gotten a little bit to where people have noticed it more just because it's kind of an ongoing it could be an ongoing Easter egg or a joke that goes along with it, they're largely ignored. Another good example is if you watch Stranger Things, for instance, a good product placement would be the Eggos that go in to the show every week. So these aren't inherently subliminal advertising, but again, it really does get into the instance of how much are we paying attention to something and how much is it, again, going into our cognition that we're paying attention to it, that we retain the information, and that we can recall the information. And so a couple of these things here. There we go. I'm kind of a mess over here. Subliminal advertising, myth or truth. And a lot of this comes into the aspect of the hidden messages within the following logos. Now, some of these I knew right away. So like the Tour de France that's going on right now, as a matter of fact, I always noticed that the cyclist was in the tour of the word here. Vio as well. Baskin Robbins has a really interesting one because they are 31 flavors and they incorporated the B and the R to demonstrate in pink here, 31, and it's a real good balance between blue and pink in this case, in terms of pop, of showing the pink stands out in this case. Amazon goes from A to Z, and you'll notice the little mark that you probably see on a lot of your Amazon packages. That's a very interesting one there. NBC and the Peacock. They call it the Peacock because right there you can see in the negative space here that the peacock exists in terms of the body and the head, as long as with the feathers. Tostitos, for instance, has two people enjoying chips and salsa in the middle. This is really clever. I've always really liked this about their logo. And then one that threw me off, and it was almost like an optical illusion the first time I saw it, and I've never been able to unsee it, is the arrow that exists within the FedEx logo. So the E and the X actually form an arrow. And so this is one of those things, if you haven't seen it before, you will never unsee it now. So let's talk a little bit about history of subliminal advertising. And so this started with James Vickery talking about movie theaters and projecting the words "eat popcorn" for 1/3000th of a second. That said, people were buying more drinks and Coke during movies, and saying that this is a myth for the case for subliminal advertising. And then Vance Packard published The Hidden Persuaders that further fueled the myth about subliminal advertising. And this basically just stated these small, very subconscious things that we don't really pick up on are kind of embedded into our brain. It's almost like if you've ever done one of those optical, they're not really optical illusions. It's a light test where you see negative space of an outline and you turn your head to face like a white wall, for instance, and an imprint from what you were staring at on the computer appears on the wall. In many of these, again, can be sometimes what's in our peripheral. So if you have done any work in communication theory or mass communication or persuasion, you may have heard of the elaboration likelihood model that talks about this notion of peripheral versus central cues within your brain, especially when you're looking at persuasive messages, and in this case, advertising. So one of the most common examples that comes out of this, and it is one of the more interesting ones that have been studied and tested, talking about subliminal seduction. So we've mentioned in the past of when we're talking about gender communication, is the stereotypical sex sells kind of mantra that exists within advertising. And the way that this was done was, here's the ad right here for gin, and in the ice cubes that exist here are written in the word sex, so that you can see the S, the E that exists here. The X is not very well labeled out, but this was the ideology of the first kind of real studied implication of subliminal advertising. And what they found, it was absolutely ineffective. It was in no way actually going to produce people to actually go out and buy said gin because of the subliminal messaging that occurred within the advertising itself. Other things we can look into, talking about the notion of finding breasts within this particular advertisement. And it is one of those things in terms of, once these commercials started to go out, once we started communicating with FTC as well as researchers, they were saying sexual symbolism, is largely ineffective. It does not work, and it is really something that was never seriously discussed. So for the longest time, this was the case, and even up till around 2009, we weren't even really talking about this as a symbol of kind of an area of truth in this case. And so for the longest time, it was myth. But there are ways that we can kind of slide advertisements into our everyday products, our everyday lives, that makes for an interesting case study for, again, recall and retention. So we can see a couple of the laws here. Filing petitions about product placement on TV in 2003 was rejected in 2005. And the arguments against product placement is unobtrusive advertising, still advertising by nature, similar to interruptions in advertising. And you can see this in sporting events too, because you can look at, like a baseball game. And I think baseball is one of the most interesting ones, is because the primarily the billboards that exist behind home plate are usually green screens that you can pay for. So as a media planner, this is actually a really interesting case study, is you can pay for a lot of the advertisements that exist behind home plate. And again, depending on the excitement of the game. So if it's a close game in the ninth inning and you've purchased some product placement there, that makes it for what you would call advertising, and it's unobtrusive. Again, you don't have to be looking at this. Another example that's not really well known is if you were to go overseas and watch international hockey, and more specifically within Sweden is a good example, at least, where if you look at some of the jerseys that exist within Swedish hockey, they have advertisements all over the place. So they've got multiple ones on their jerseys, front and back. They have advertisements on their pants, their helmet, their shin guard tape has advertisement. And for the most part, you would sit there and say, I don't even know what team I'm rooting for in this particular case. But the interesting thing is there are no commercials. So usually I would sit there and say, I will take that over having to watch a hockey game in the States where there are a lot of commercials. Now, granted, I love hockey in the States, but that's kind of beside the point. Consumers have the right to know who is persuading them. And this is where you would say maybe product placement in this case is an subliminal advertising. And I would kind of argue that it's not. It's not, again, trying to fool you or anything. You can recognize what's going on, and again, through the area of persuasion, kind of make your own assumption. But we'll get into that as advertisers always get a little bit smarter in this case as the times progress and as we consistently move away from the 30-second spot ad. People are influenced by product placement without awareness, especially children. And this is because of usually media literacy and what media literacy does in terms of recognizing what is content on like television, for instance, and what is sales within that. And again, as new studies are coming out, this is more of a streaming generation right here. I mean, even it's older as college students. I can't really talk to too many people that have cable because not many people have cable, and that's actually going to the same with younger and younger audiences here. That there are also people who stream, in which case it makes things harder to advertise. And the disclosure before and at the end of the program is not conspicuous as well. So, contemporary uses of subliminal advertising within logo design. In terms of like LG, for instance, with Life is Good, if you look at how they incorporate their logo, the LG Toblerone has this one took me forever to see by itself. Thank goodness for this graphic. Toblerone with theirs, the Stanley Cup champions, Washington Capitals, I hate to say it, but has the capital that is embedded within the logo. And again, this would be an area where you would say, is this an ethical procedure or not to put within their particular logos? And, normally I would just say this is good creative design in terms of corporate logos and the messages that kind of exist within their logos itself. But where it gets really different and where I think the biggest ethical qualm that we have here is within advertorials and native advertising. Because when we're dealing with advertising, one of the things that happens is that we are engaging in what are called availability heuristics, which ultimately means that we're doing mental shortcuts, and we don't really think about what's being said. So for the longest time, we have been exposed to things like blogs and tweets that are associated with blogs. BuzzFeed lists were a big component in this. And so advertorials in this case, you can see down in the bottom here that it is sponsored. All of these are promoted by an organization itself. And for social media, that isn't as big a deal, per se, with advertorials. And I only say that because it's such a small space. So this is a good lesson within visual communication and advertising, is that the text box is so small that you could see within the message and within the message and the corporate entity, like a suggested post, that occurs. Now, does it make it any less annoying is another case, and again, do you find it credible is a completely different case. So, but again, the main thing is, do you feel like you're being coerced, that this is an actual post from a friend or someone that you subscribe to versus an actual advertisement itself. Whereas native advertising, and a lot of this not stemmed from, I suppose, but became really popular with BuzzFeed lists. BuzzFeed lists for people in my age demographic of kind of the older millennial generation would look into kind of nostalgia, and so they make these lists of top 20 things that you remember as a kid and so forth. And so they put things that would really play to my nostalgia, and then at the end it would be like Burger King chicken fries. You used to like Burger King playground, so now try the Burger King chicken fries. And it's at the very end of it. And again, this is something that if I weren't looking at it, I would say that this is something that I was coerced by saying this is not a staff writer, this is from an organization. And this can also be incorporated here. Sorry, I got a siren going by me here. This can also be incorporated in the terms of, oh, I lost my train of thought there. Again, this is the notion of seamless advertising, and the main thing is, do you feel like you're being manipulated in viewing something? I said coerced earlier, I meant manipulated. Or do you feel like you kind of have a choice in this case? One thing I will mention with native advertising is there is this sense of kind of feeling to be cheated to some regard, is if you view something that looks like an article and at the very end it turns out to be an advertisement. It's very much like when you find out through word of mouth. So let's say somebody recommends a restaurant to you, and you find out that person does work for the restaurant. You might feel kind of cheated in that perspective. So again, a lot of cool things to think about within subliminal advertising. And there's also stealth marketing that can be occurring here that you may not really think about. For example, Sony Ericsson hired young actors and actresses to be fake tourists. North Face Korea, which is one of my favorites, would have people going into a store for North Face, picking out like jackets or that kind of thing, and they would do something really cool is, you know what, I'll actually post it on YouTube. They have a really cool social experiment that goes with it. Good seamless advertising, and I'll actually show it to you through As You Learn. I'll post a link to that. And then one of my other favorites, that actually they did 3 variations of it, which they're making a movie out of it now for some reason. The Pepsi test drive with Jeff Gordon, which was absolutely one of my favorites, where they take a very nice muscle car and Jeff Gordon drives it around, and the person who is in charge of the dealership is not aware that it's Jeff Gordon, so he obviously is terrified and really pissed about how Jeff Gordon is driving this like a mad person. And they said, it's a social experiment, just having fun there. The other is within basketball. I think it's, oh goodness, I already forgot the name of it. I think it's Uncle Drew or something. I'm actually going to look that up real quick. Uncle Drew. Okay, good. Or again, a NBA star dressed up as an older man playing basketball. The same thing they did with street soccer. They did the exact same thing, which was kind of interesting. So this is more or less an idea and just kind of a crash course of subliminal advertising. The main thing to consider within ethics when you're looking at potentially coming up with ideas for your advertisement, a lot of these I think are brilliant, and I think they're interesting, and I think they're fun. So like the Jeff Gordon one was a ton of fun. Whereas, again, Sony Ericsson, is that considered ethical to hire people to promote mobile phones? Is the Uncle Drew or the street soccer example, is that considered ethical? Whatever it may be, it is something that take into consideration of what is good advertising, what is going to get your message out there, but at the same time, what gives the people the freedom to respond, because that is the main difference between persuasion and manipulation, is this ideology of freedom to choose one way or the other, to engage, if you will. So that's it for the week. I hope you all have a splendid weekend. Like I said, make sure to finish your discussion board and also to finish your case study. And like I said, the final projects are up on As You Learn, so please check those out. And if you have any questions, let me know. I hope you have a great weekend. All right, bye.